Welcome to IAM, everybody, a presentation of Maryland Centers for Independent Living. My name is Lydia Belioska, and I'm the Executive Director of Southern Maryland Center for Independent Living. We serve Charles, Calvert, and St. Mary's counties here in Southern Maryland. And we are very pleased, as a part of all the other stills in the state of Maryland, to present Independence Amplified Maryland. And bring you this program that affects the lives of all Marylanders and benefits with great information, especially those of us living with disabilities in the state and their caregivers. This program is being recorded, as Heather mentioned. It will be on YouTube in about 48 hours, I believe it takes to show up there. All participants will be muted, but if you would like to say something, a comment, a question later on, you'll have a chance. You can unmute. But we do recommend if you can put your questions in the chat. It makes it easier for us to follow through, make sure we give you a chance. Also, at the end of today, we'll have a few chances for announcements for other organizations or individuals to announce community events or other activities of interest. So now I think we should go ahead and get started. And Sarah Basehart from Independence Now will introduce our guest speaker.
Sorry, I'm going to unmute myself first. I'm Sarah Basehart, the Executive Director of Independence Now. We're the SIL that serves Montgomery and Prince George's counties. And I'm excited to introduce Amy Hixson, who's going to do our presentation today on independent living history and philosophy, which we are very happy that she's here today. And I have a great bio, probably the best bio I've ever received when introducing someone. And it describes Amy as, Amy is a native Hawaiian, Japanese, Caucasian who's landlocked in Kansas, where she works for the Topeka Independent Living Resource Center, a center for independent living that has been around for 40 years this month, almost as many as Amy has been around. Amy is an organizer with Kansas and National Adapt. She is the secretary for the National Council on Independent Living and the co-chair of NICL's LTSS Healthcare Subcommittee. And she's serving on NICL's Presidential Task Force on Anti-Racism and Equity. She lives on a sustenance farm, which we'll get to if we need to, called Misfit Farm, with mostly disabled large dogs and small livestock, her wife, and a chronically unmowed lawn. So I'm going to turn things over to Amy to teach everybody about independent living history and philosophy. Thank you, Amy.
Thank you, Sarah. Thanks, everyone. Nice to be here. I am, we'll have a slideshow, so I'll do a screen share here. Just to continue to sort of build out, I want to make sure that folks, I announce my pronouns. And so my pronouns are she, her, and hers. And then a visual description of what you're dealing with here is, I am as pointed out earlier, somewhat tired looking today. Olive complected woman with long hair. I used to say it was black with gray, but now it's gray with black. Currently in a braid sort of along the side, and I'm wearing a red long sleeve t-shirt and sitting against a backdrop of closed window blinds. Because, you know, otherwise it would look like I have a halo, and we all know that's not the case. Anyhow, so this is great. This is really in this presentation. I did give this presentation at Nickel. You know, ordinarily I turn my camera off because even after 10 months of being in, you know, Zoom land, I still don't know quite where to orient my eyes at any given point in time. So that will be somewhat distracting as we go along, but we'll share the screen and hopefully folks will be so enchanted with the images. Thank you, Heather, that we will, that will, you won't be too distracted. So I'm going to go ahead and share the screen here, see what I can do that way. And this slideshow. Maybe not. All right, folks, see that? So we're going to talk today about living philosophy, disability rights, history. Are you okay, Sarah? We good?
Your microphone was like real funky for a second, but then it stopped. So I think we're
Okay.
good.
All right. Thank you. So, and so in kind of going through this, it's like it's just then then sort of occurred that there is for those of us who have been involved in the work for a while to sort of gloss past the fact that disability history, the history of the way people with disabilities have been treated in this country is not nice. And so as we sort of walk through this, there are some because history, people with disabilities is a history that involves things like eugenics and discrimination and institutionalized bias and all of the things that I think that on some level we live with, we live with as such a pervasive part of our life experience that we take that's like how things are supposed to be. And so I like to try to use this as kind of a content or trigger warning, because we all deserve a pat on the back on some level, quite frankly.
Hey, Amy, I'm going to stop you one more second. Sorry, we're still, things are like breaking up. I'm not sure if it's your Wi-Fi connection. I know sometimes if people turn their video off, it makes it the stronger the sound connection, but
okay.
I don't want to mess you up either.
No, it's fine. I'm good with that. Let me turn my screen off. It's a weird. I would happily turn my video off.
Just that sometimes it gives you stronger connection.
There we go. Well, I even came to the office. How's that? Any better?
You sound good so far, but what's weird is it sort of would sound fine and then not fine. So we'll just go ahead and I'll stop you if anything.
All right. I'll also try not to fidget. That may actually also help us. So, all right. So off we go to the first slide. So, okay. So what we have here is a sepia-toned photograph. There are 3 females. Down in the lower right-hand side, there's actually the overlay of an image of an infant. In the middle of the photograph is a middle-aged woman, and then there's an elderly woman sitting to her side. The women are wearing light-colored dresses, and they're looking somberly at the camera. So I'd like to introduce the Buck family. The baby, the infant, is Vivian. In the middle is Carrie, and Emma, her mother, sits to her left. Carrie Buck is the named plaintiff in what came to be the United States Supreme Court case of Buck v. Bell, which was a 1927 case that found constitutional state laws forcing institutionalized people to involuntarily undergo sterilization. So the plaintiff in the case, Carrie Buck, Carrie and Emma had been committed to the Virginia colony for epileptics and feeble-minded in Lynchburg, Virginia. Carrie and Emma were both judged to be, quote, feeble-minded and promiscuous, primarily because they had both had born children out of wedlock, even though in both of those instances, there's strong evidence to suggest that those pregnancies were the result of rape. Now, the Buck v. Bell case is, and I talk about this, I'm going to go a little bit off script here because the Buck v. Bell case is significant, and I think in some level has taken on a greater significance in recent days with recent events. And so I think that folks, probably you don't have to have turned the news on and gone very deep in the past few weeks to have heard the stories about women in detention centers who are being involuntarily sterilized. And then in the past week, we were talking earlier on this call, I had been able to be in DC last week to join with folks who were opposing the nomination of Amy Coney Barrett to the Supreme Court. And one of the things that drove me sort of toward that advocacy is the fact that Buck v. Bell was decided in 1927 as a result of the sterilization practices in institutions. Over 70,000 people in our country were involuntarily sterilized. And Buck v. Bell, as Supreme Court precedent, has never been overturned. And so it may well be the case that as a constitutional principle, even if in the specific instances in those ICE detainment centers, women were sterilized against their consent, the door is still open because of the Supreme Court holding in that Buck v. Bell case that if it is the decision of a state to involuntarily sterilize people in any type of institutional setting, that there may not be any constitutional protections against that practice. And so one of the themes that we'll hear sort of time and again as we move through this discussion today is how completely interconnected the status of people with disabilities is to status of other marginalizations, whether it's racial or gender or religious or sexual orientation, how all of these things are all tied together and represent and reflect a very similar kind of history. So it's worth noting that Virginia wasn't alone in having state laws that allowed for the involuntary sterilization. And the goal behind all of these laws across the country was to eliminate what were determined to be undesirable traits, a practice that we would now, without hesitance, refer to as eugenics. And it's worth noting that in the Buck v. Bell case, it was a strong majority decision. There was only one dissenting opinion, and the justice that wrote the majority opinion was none other than Oliver Wendell Holmes. And he, in so doing, effectively gave Virginia permission to engage in eugenics, and it wholeheartedly embraced the policy. So the next slide we have is a colorfully redacted social media post. There's a bunch of rainbow colored lines surrounding it and scribbling out names and things like that. And what the post says at the top is, quote, "Hi, person with autism here. To the anti-vaxxers commenting, let's pretend for a second that vaccines have anything to do with autism whatsoever. Could you tell me why you'd rather have a dead kid than one like me?" And then under that, there is a reply from another poster who says, "Another autistic person here, completely agree with what you said." Vaccinations, not unlike masks, are a well-established public health measure. They protect us and they protect the people around us. Hiding behind individuals who would flout fundamental public health recommendations have been, in the not so distant shadows, organizations like Autism Speaks. And recently, with the reintroduction of the MDA telethon, organizations who ultimately seek a cure or to eliminate a particular disability or condition, many of which may or may not even be life-threatening in their, in their nature. Fundamentally, these anti-vaxxers, fundamentally, these people, what is it that they want? They want their child to not be disabled. And so here we are in a time of COVID, and we have, again, those similar types of issues where over 85,000 people have died in institutions, and we hear in popular discussions talks about the most vulnerable and herd immunity, where demands to open the economy and recognize the autonomy of our ability to wear masks. And all of those things are really just the stepping into a conversation that is about letting the sick and vulnerable die. And to that extent, the next photograph is a picture of a Black man lying in a hospital bed. Is a Black man. His name is Michael Hixson. He's wearing a blue hospital gown. He has oxygen tubes on his face. He's smiling at the camera, and around the head of his bed are 5 smiling young Black people, all leaning in towards him. These are his children. Michael Hixson was a 46-year-old Black man with quadriplegia, blindness, and a brain injury. These were all conditions that occurred after he had a heart attack in 2017. Since 2017, Mr. Hixson had been in and out of hospitals, rehabilitation and nursing facilities, and he had been home at times with his wife and their 5 children. Mr. Hixson this summer was refused treatment at St. David's Hospital, South Austin, where he had been sent after he had fallen ill with COVID-19, which he had been exposed to through a worker at the rehabilitation facility where he had been staying. The hospital withheld his tube-supplied food and water despite the objections of his wife, Melissa. And even though Michael might have survived the illness with the medical care that is generally provided to COVID patients, Michael died on June 11th because his doctors did not believe he had a sufficient quality of life to justify curative treatment, and that because of his disabilities, saving his life was futile. Mr. Hixson's case was an individual travesty, but it happened in a larger context. All over the country, in response to potential shortages of space and equipment in hospitals, states are discussing crisis standards of care, and we are seeing the type of negative judgments made about Mr. Hixson's quality of life, his disability status, and the value enshrined in guidance documents that determine how limited resources should be rationed. Except it's worth noting that in Mr. Hixson's case, there wasn't a shortage of resources. There was no care that Mr. Hixson was using or receiving that was denying any other person with COVID care. That judgment can run so deep in our institutions and in our, and through medical providers, that they don't even need to have the shortage to justify withholding life-sustaining measures. And it's worth noting, not to pick on Texas, except for I think that we can all agree, since none of us are living in Texas, that we're glad not to be there. But in the past probably 2 weeks, there have been 2 other cases that I've followed and been involved with. One, Tinsley Lewis, who is an infant, a 1-year-old infant who was born with heart conditions and has literally lived the first year of her life in a hospital. And we became, as part of National Adapt, amicus parties to the Texas Supreme Court case where they're asking to continue to provide this infant with life-sustaining services while while she continues to receive treatment. The state of Texas has what appear to be some particularly problematic futility laws, which again, on a very fundamental level, go to judgments about the quality of life that people have with disabilities, I suppose, or lack thereof. And so to place things into context, one of the things that we like to remind folks is that the value in independent living, where we stand in independent living, is that disability is not the problem, as the slide says. Independent living says that disability is not something that needs to be cured. And independent living holds that disability is not something that we need to be ashamed of, or that we need to conceal, or is something that we overcome. The problem, according to independent living, is that society does not value our lives. That society would rather flout public health practices, they would rather elevate the economy, or they would rather eschew common decency than keep us alive. So the next picture is a black and white photograph. And this is from, there's actually a whole website of photographs from the institution for Willowbrook in New York. And so in this picture, it's a black and white photo. Women are sitting around in a room looking relatively idle. Some are crouched together on the floor. There's a woman in the foreground perched on a bench and looking at the camera. And so they're in just various states of sort of non-activity. The website that I got this from described the Willowbrook Experience like this. Most of the Willowbrook Experience was defined by constant neglect, a condition that the overstressed and underfunded staff were not necessarily responsible for. In some buildings, the mentally disabled were let to huddle in rooms, moaning, fidgeting, meandering, all with little care or resources. Many went naked for lack of clothing and supervision. Others sat drenched in their urine and feces, and some smeared them on the walls and on their clothes with no available garments to replace them. Sexual and physical abuse at the hands of fellow patients and employees was common, as was disease. The next is a color photograph of the marquee in front of the Hacienda Healthcare. The sign of the facility is in the foreground. There's a parking lot with cars and a single-story building in the background. Hacienda Healthcare is an institution in Arizona where in 2019, a woman who had not exhibited consciousness and therefore the ability to engage in consent for years gave birth. And months later, after this horrifying event, maggots were found in the gauze of another patient's wound. 2019, Hacienda Healthcare. And next, a black and white photograph of 7 children sitting in a high-sided crib. The children have their backs against the sides of the crib so that they can all fit. One is looking directly at the camera. The other children are looking off to the sides between the bars on the crib. This is actually how children were transported at Willowbrook. Most did not have their own wheelchairs. They were not provided with assistance in walking independently. And the facility itself was overstaffed in very short time. The school opened in October of 1947 and had 20 residents. By 1955, it had reached its capacity of 4,000 occupants. And around that time, hepatitis infections ran rampant among patients and staff. And only a short time later, in 1960, they had an outbreak of measles that killed 60 patients. And Gail made a comment in the chat, which I think is a good comment. I mean, which, yeah, is exactly true. You know, to the point around Hacienda, is that we hear this all the time, that it's not like that anymore in institutions. But the reality, I mean, one of the starkest realities of COVID is, I think we can all very easily argue now that that's nothing short of bullshit. That these are the places where we send people to die. That infection control, I mean, something as fundamental as infection control is not present in these institutions, and probably, quite frankly, isn't possible. Putting so many people together in congregate locations is just, I think at some point in time, you know, we're gonna have to recognize that it's completely inhumane. To the point, in the next picture, we have a color photograph of two women. There's a Black woman in the background, and there's a white woman with her hair pulled back in the foreground, and they're both holding pictures of children. These two women appeared before Congress in early 2019. These two women are the grieving mothers of two of the 11 children who died at the Wanakay Nursing Home for Children in New Jersey. The children in that facility died of a virus. It took the staff several weeks. It took several weeks for the medical staff at that facility to identify the cause of illness and to implement preventative measures to stop its spread. Sound familiar? These grieving mothers, they thought they were doing what was best for their children. Their children, they were told, were medically fragile, that they needed these rehabilitative services. These women believed that the professionals in these facilities were better equipped to meet their children's need. They didn't feel like they had a better option than the institution. And so they went with the best worst choice, which turned out to be really no choice at all. You know, I think that probably, to Gail's point above, you know, there's probably not a single one of us who has spent any time on social media where you haven't had that encounter with somebody whose mother really had no choice, you know, as they say, but to go into a facility. You know, and that's why, you know, continuing to press forward with developing choice, with developing resources, you know, with pushing back against this institutional bias is so critically important. We know now more than ever that it is, in fact, a matter of life and not death. I mean, Mr. Hixson, he ended up in the St. David's Hospital because he was exposed to COVID. Because when you're in an institution, you can't control who comes in and out of that building. And you don't get to choose who comes in and out of your room and what type of equipment they use and how close they get to you, unlike the things that we can control in our own homes. I can tell you, speaking from experience in Kansas, you know, we have over half of the deaths that have happened in our state. And we're a very rural state. That's how you can sustenance farm, right? So, you know, so we've had like under 1,000 deaths total, but about 500 of those deaths have happened in institutions. And we know that we made our state start tracking those numbers for home and community-based services. And I can tell you that less than 100 people total who receive home and community-based services in our state have even contracted COVID. And less than a handful of those people have died. You know, and we're talking about a similar number of people. In Kansas, you know, our quote unquote rebalancing is pretty evenly balanced. But I think that one of the things that we're going to find is, you know, at the end of the day, notwithstanding the institutional bias, you know, notwithstanding the fact that masks and gloves and gowns are drop shipped into nursing homes, and the rest of us have scrambled to get our hands on that type of personal protective equipment, notwithstanding that, I think that what we're going to find at the end of this COVID pandemic is that the people who could exercise the most control over decision-making, who had the greatest access to independent living and control of their lives and their services, are going to be the folks who've ended up faring the best. Lord knows we couldn't do any worse. So what's the value with independent living? The value of independent living is this premise that people with disabilities belong in mainstream society. Under independent living model, no one is too disabled to live in the community. And that's critical. And that just is so important. Because independent living says that society can, in fact, support people with all types of disabilities, with all types of nature, severity. And we can do that in their own homes, and we can do that on their own terms. And independent living recognizes fundamentally that people who lay their head on a pillow in an institution aren't given the opportunity to get up, to go to work every day, or to go to school, or to volunteer, or to have a family, you know, to fall in love, to go to the park, to do the things that give our lives meaning. All right, another photograph. It is a photograph from around the 1960s. There's a young person, or what looks to be a young person, sorting screws from a big box into smaller containers. So the history of sheltered workshops are that they first appeared in America just a little over a century ago. And they were an outgrowth of quote unquote special schools for the blind, whose curriculum concentrated on provision of simple forms of vocational training in limited manual skills such as knitting, weaving, chair caning, and music and other arts. So across time, these workshops took on less of an approach than they were teaching job skills to become more and more. So they took on less of an approach of teaching job skills to being more and more the job, right? And so they became this sort of dropping off point for people with disabilities. And when they became this sort of catchment, then efforts to get people into integrated competitive employment, well, that fell off by the wayside. So in my state, for example, one of our she recently retired center directors was a woman named Chris Owens. She was blind, and she had gone to college and then had gone on to get her master's degree before she had become a center director. And so in the early mid-1970s, when she had finished her master's degree, her vocational rehabilitation counselor came to her after her graduation and proposed, after her graduation with a master's degree, and proposed sending her to make brooms at a sheltered workshop. Sheltered workshops are generally segregated employment situations. People with the same types of disabilities are all congregated in a single location. And often workers have a 14C certificate, which is a certification that the providers send to the Department of Labor saying that this is somewhat a person who couldn't otherwise be employed in a competitive, integrated environment. Those certificates in and of themselves are limiting. So yeah, and somebody actually mentioned, and I think it is a critically important point, is that the unique issues of folks who are Black, Indigenous, people of color, is that actually one of the other things that we're seeing today in real time unfold in front of us is the fact that BIPOC folks, Black disabled people, there's excellent statistics that indicate without any equivocation that the vast majority of exposure to COVID and associated death is happening in those specific communities, not just disabled, but more pointedly toward Black, Indigenous, where again, resources are just not being made available to the tribes at all, and people of color across the spectrum. COVID is exacting a particular toll on those communities, both interestingly enough, both as a matter of higher numbers of COVID deaths in facilities where there are higher concentrations of multiply marginalized people, and also staff, the staff who are providing these services being overly represented by people from BIPOC populations. And so we have to keep an eye to those issues as well. So anyhow, so yeah, sheltered workshops. So yeah, oh wow, they're old. It's been over a century. Well, not exactly. Because next we have a color photograph from 2019. 2019. And in this, there's a Black man sitting at a table, sorting pins or clips of some sort into lines. The man is photographed in profile, has a mustache, is wearing glasses, and has on a jacket and a shower cap. In 2013, the United States Department of Justice announced a consent decree with the state of Rhode Island after they found that the state of Rhode Island had systematically failed both youth and adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities by literally using their state's secondary education system to pipeline people with IDD into sheltered and segregated employment. Rhode Island, 2013. Literally, that state had made the sheltered workshops the gatekeepers for services and supports that would have otherwise helped thousands of people with disabilities secure and maintain integrated competitive wage employment. There is, oh man, I just lost the name. Dan, there's a movie that came out that is about, that's about transition age people with disabilities, primarily folks with intellectual and developmental disabilities. Dan Habib, thank you, Kara. Intelligent Lives, there we go. Thank you. So in the movie, Intelligent Lives, one of the people who is in that movie is actually an adult in Rhode Island who is one of these people who had been previously pipelined into this system, and who was then being able to access vocational services and have a real job in the community. It's a woman in the film. And so I remember sort of watching the film, having sort of known about this case, and then thinking, wait a minute, you know, I wonder if there's any connection, and then going back and figuring that out. Thank you so much. And then similarly, recently there was, recently, last summer, it feels like a lifetime ago, but last summer, the Department of Labor was collecting testimony from folks responsive to questions about the 14C certification and waiver program. And so there were a lot of advocates who went around trying to encourage people to talk about the need for better resources for competitive integrated employment. And one of the best stories that I saw sort of in that whole, one of the best pieces of testimony was written by a young man named Evan Nodvin, whose sister Allison actually works for the Center for Public Representation as an attorney. And she shared his testimony about his experiences in competitive integrated employment up until COVID, which actually Evan has actually been able to find community employment since this. But prior to that, he had been a courtesy assistant at a health club where he had done everything from the front desk to the laundry room. And in his testimony, he reminded the Department of Labor, it is important that people with disabilities be given the chance to have a real job. Some of my friends have been told that they can only work in a workshop or be in a day program. That is not fair. People with disabilities can work in community jobs at fair wages when they have a job that's a good fit and can get employment supports as needed. So there you have it. So one of the fun things that I got to discover as I had been, and by fun, I mean not fun, actually, is, is again, harkens back to this. And I think to the comments in the chat box as well, kind of similarly. In this next photograph, there's actually a sepia tone photograph taken from the back of a crowd of seated people. And at the front of the crowd is a staging area with a sign at the top that reads Eugenic and Health Exhibit. The back of the benches in the rear have writing on them that read Topeka Parks and Topeka Parking. And so just, again, so Texas doesn't think I'm unfairly beating up on them. This photo was actually taken in Topeka, Kansas, where I am currently also seated. Capital city for the state of Kansas, home of the world famous Topeka Zoo, and also the Westboro Baptist Church, God help us, and birthplace of the Fitter Families Project, which is part of our was part of our state fair activities. And in the Fitter Families Project, winners were awarded a prize medal that was emblazoned with, "Yea, I have a goodly heritage." These competitions encouraged families to breed superior children that would fit the rigid judging standards. The idea of eugenic marriages began to take hold with the popularity of the Fitter Families contest. These marriages were designed to breed the most desirable offspring, much like we were talking earlier about Katie's great uncle and his his pig husbandry book, only for families, for humans. And then in Kansas, we actually had state laws that lent support to these programs that included a marriage restriction law from 1903. And that marriage restriction law, it didn't apply to women over the age of 45, because those of us who've been around longer than the ADA apparently are not going to be bearing children, which you're welcome for that. And breaking the law, however, breaking the law, marrying someone under the age of 45 who is deemed unfit by reason of being an alcoholic or being disabled could result in up to $1,000 fine or 3 years in prison. Now, again, back to sort of the discussion about the parallels in disability history and the history of other marginalized communities in our country. Interestingly enough, just this morning, I was listening to a book called Mothers of Mass. What is it? Mothers of Mass. It's super boring. It would sound as if it were a super boring topic, but it is Mothers of Massive Resistance. And it's a historical review of, quite frankly, the role that women, in particular white women, played in the history of the country, especially as it dealt with genetic and ethnic purity and the reinforcement of institutions of white supremacy. And so one of the discussions from today is the author, who's a historian from the University of Chicago, is talking, Elizabeth Gillespie is her name, is talking about was how, if you look at the fields of education and social work and how heavily populated those just how gender specific those particular areas and professions were in the early development of our country, those women were asked not just to provide education to our children, but they were also asked to ethnically categorize, and also, interestingly enough, to the extent that they once categorized children by their ethnicity, they then catalog them based on deviances. So disability, behaviors, some behaviors that we might not even, might not even sort of raise an eyebrow now, but behaviors that those people, that those particular once you got tagged with that ethnic tag, once you were determined to be somebody who was of mixed heritage or mixed race, you then automatically went into this next pot where you were expected to have your additional deviances or disabilities cataloged alongside that. Sorry, just a random thing that that's been rolling around in my head, so you all had to hear it vomited out there. So next we have a color photograph of a wedding ceremony. That's my friend Carrie. The ceremony is taking place outdoors in front of a white pergola. In the center of the frame is a minister. The bride is in a wheelchair. She's wearing a cream-colored dress. The groom is seated across from her wearing a gray tuxedo. The groomsmen are seated in the foreground in matching gray tuxedos, and the bridesmaids are seated behind the bride wearing yellow dresses. Again, interestingly enough, another thing I learned today was HR 4280 that was introduced in 2019. HR 4280, I don't know how this one escaped my attention, was actually introduced by a group of House Democrats in 2019 to address the institutional barriers for people with disabilities when it comes to marriage. It also proposes dramatic and much needed increases to the SSI payment levels as well. But as we all know that Social Security, in particular, the Supplemental Security Income Program, has a marriage penalty built into how it calculates benefit amounts. So in a nutshell, two disabled individuals receive more in SSI individually than they would as a married couple. And also unmarried, each person could have up to $2,000 in individual assets. But once those two people become married, that cap, is it $4,000? No, because it's SSI math, it's $3,000. So you can accumulate less quote unquote wealth to the extent that $2,000 represents any type of wealth, quite frankly. But you get less of it if you have two people on SSI who get married. Similarly, just a way of reminder is last year, quote unquote, Dr. Phil McGraw had hosted an episode of his show highlighting the struggle that a particular couple was having. One member of the couple happened to be a quad. And of course, Dr. Phil, not satisfied to treat the couple's issues as just that, communication issues that maybe all couples might confront. The good doctor felt it necessary to make sweeping generalizations, concluding the relationship in which one person is disabled and any type of caregiving is involved will always fail, always, as in 100% of the time. So my friend in this picture, Carrie, was one of thousands of people who responded to Dr. Phil's ableist bullshit with a social media hashtag 100 out of 100. Carrie talked about in her post, she actually had talked about how the past weekend she and her husband and her daughter had taken a trip to Oklahoma. Her husband races cars, those kind of goofy cars. And so in order to go, he had to help her get in and out of his truck. He carried their bags in her chair, threw them in the back of his truck. And when they got to the hotel, the bed was too high. So he had to help her get into the bed. And she says, this is caregiving. He cares that she goes with him. So she lets him give her help, even when things that are the problems. I mean, right? Every one of those things. It wasn't a problem with her. It wasn't a problem with him. It was a problem with discrimination in the built environment and the barriers that society imposes, not the inherent barriers that exist with being disabled. And that gets us to our next point in independent living, which is that people with disabilities are in fact capable of living meaningful lives. Independent living says that all people have skills, talents, and interests, have innate value, and that independent living says people with disabilities should have and be able to exercise choice about what they do, when, where, and with whom they do it. So on the physical barriers issue, we have next a photograph of a newspaper clipping with the title, Aggieville Inaccessibility Stirs Protest, with a photograph of the back of 2 wheelchairs with "We Will Be Heard" signs on the back of them, and an angry man standing in the background pointing. He's clearly not happy. Manhattan, Kansas was the site for what is to date one of the earliest and most significant ADA Title II lawsuits, Tyler versus City of Manhattan. Toby Tyler, who's a longtime adapter, now lives in Wisconsin, is the named plaintiff in this case. And so what had happened is that after the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act, the City of Manhattan refused to comply with requirements that they complete a self-evaluation and transition plan, including how they were going to use the federal funds that they'd been receiving since, I don't know, the 1970s, to include accessibility in their city planning, community improvement, and their infrastructure development. It had been 20 years, the city had just failed to act on these. And so among the problems that Toby encountered along his journey in Manhattan, Kansas, were that there were tons of sidewalks that didn't have curb cuts, that at some of the parks where he was trying to get in to see his grandkids play baseball, they had placed a metal post in the middle of the sidewalk, thereby rendering it inaccessible, so that they could keep motorized vehicles out of the park. And the city council themselves were meeting on the second floor of a building without an elevator, and they would refuse to move the proceedings to a location on a lower ground so that Toby could participate. Next, we have a black and white photograph of people crawling upstairs with officers appearing to obstruct their way or at least engage them. Some officers appear to be talking to protesters, and some of the protesters may be talking back. This demonstration is on the day of oral argument in a lawsuit brought by a man named George Lane, who was a paraplegic in Tennessee, who had literally crawled up the stairs in his local courthouse in order to respond to criminal charges in the early 2000s. When Lane refused to crawl to the second-story courtroom at a subsequent appearance at court, he was arrested for failure to appear, he was sent to jail, and he responded by suing the state for violation of the Americans with Disabilities Act. The judge refused to move the hearing to a lower floor. I mean, you know, it was one case he could have done it, but refused to do it. And then, of course, we have a color photograph here of a jubilant Ali Stroker, returning backstage after winning her individual Tony Award in 2019. Ali sits in her wheelchair smiling. Her hands are raised in celebration. She's wearing a yellow formal gown, and her blonde hair is in braids. Despite being the first person in a wheelchair to win a Tony Award like this, and she also won a second award later in the evening, but Ali was not able to go on the stage to accept the second award along with the rest of the cast of the Broadway production of Oklahoma, because she had returned to the audience and there was no ramp, no ability for her to get back onto stage a second time to receive her Tony Award. Oops. See, like my friend Carrie, you know, the barrier in her relationship, the barriers in society are the problem. Independent living people says that people should have access to all areas of community life. And independent living says obstacles to full access must be removed. Literally, just this year, earlier this year in Williamsport, Pennsylvania, a city council meeting was being held yet again in an inaccessible location, even after 3 years of intensive efforts by local advocates to get that meeting moved to a more accessible location. Eventually, things boiled over earlier this year where advocates showed up and protested. There were arrests. There was intense media pressure. pressure, and an investigation by the Department of Justice to get the smallest concession just to move the room of the city council meeting so that people could get in there. Even here, even today, 30 years after the Americans with Disabilities Act. All right. So we have here a black and white photograph. It's an actual photograph from a circus with the words "human freaks" over main sideshow and images of people standing and exhibiting different physical traits. People with disabilities have long been othered. We've been perceived as odd or limited or lacking somehow. Literally, historically, people with disabilities have been treated as sideshow freaks. This othering allows mainstream society to single us out. It enables them to minimize us. It enables them to discredit our experiences, our values, our qualities, our traits, or in most instances, just to be overlooked. Othering people is reductive in that it subsumes an individual identity into a stereotype. You know, any one of us who've gone into a restaurant where there are people in chairs and people who not in chairs, and you see the people at the restaurant speak to the folks on two legs versus the other people, understand just sort of, you can see it play out in real time, just how quickly people default to that type of othering or reduction. Similarly, we have a black and white lithograph image next of a young man wearing a suit. He's sitting in a chair. The young man appears not to have arms, and he appears to be playing a violin that's propped up onto some type of footstool using his feet. We have a George Wolfe Youth Internship program here at my agency. There are kids that start usually ages 14 to 19. And we start them off. The idea is to sort of give them a crash course in disability history, independent living philosophy. And so I like to ask them questions like this, you know, like, where is it written that a violin is to be tucked under somebody's chin and sawed at furiously with a handheld horsehair bow? I mean, what is, I don't know. That's the way it's done. But that's, there's nothing that says it's the way it has to be. And the reality is that disabled people are incredibly creative in the face of strict ideas about how things should be done. And in the current situation, living with COVID, living in this new day and age, it's our creativity, our thinking about how to get shit done, notwithstanding how society has been telling us to get it done. That what has led the way. Remote work, remote school. I mean, there are so many of these things that have become common practices that for years we have begged as accommodations for folks that were just sort of as a matter of course done for folks so that they could continue to be productive. But the thinking that got us there, the creativity, the ingenuity, the ways to get around the barriers about how things have been done or should be done, we led the way. Disabled folks led the way. And then finally, so everybody says, oh, here it comes, the inspiration porn. We have a photograph of an absolutely adorable and completely ornery looking little boy who's running on a track with two of those carbon blades on the bottom half of his legs, with a printed motto across the picture that reads, "The only disability in life is a bad attitude." Little boy has a crew cut, is wearing a white t-shirt with the racing bib and the number 43 on it. Objecting one group of people for the benefit or the pleasure of another group of people? Well, welcome to the technical definition of porn. So on the one hand, we have, look at those freaks. And at the other end, we have, well, however bad my life is, it could be worse. I mean, right? I could be him. Either way, These images objectify disabled people for the benefit of non-disabled people. They're there so that people can look at them and then think that, I don't know, things aren't so bad for you. Maybe you put your worries into perspective. Because again, like those anti-vaxxer parents, the worst thing people can imagine happening to them, the thing that people fear the most would be to be that little boy up there or to have that little boy up there. And we know that that's the last thing on earth, those folks should be worried about. It's kind of like I tell people, my mother a few years ago said to me, that it's when I first started rescuing dogs. And of course, anybody who starts rescuing animals, it gets out of hand pretty quickly before you get your shit together and you kind of pull it all back in. And, my mom said to me one day, in a moment of rare honesty on her part, was that I'm just worried that, that in 10 years from now, you're still going to be living, in this, trailer in the middle of nowhere, with a dozen dogs. And I said to my mom, if I were you, I might turn my concern to something real, like world peace, right? I mean, or something important, that's me in this trailer and 10 dogs is no big deal. So I always look at it sort of the same way, is that, hey, disability is, we should really turn our attention to real things to be concerned about, right? Not the normal life process. So the only disability in life is a bad attitude. It's a real problem. That's a real problem for our people. That's a real problem for the disability community. I actually refer to this as the motto for the antisocial model of disability, because this kind of phrasing, this kind of statement, it centers the problem as the person, right? If only the person had a better attitude, they'd be able to walk or hear or see or speak clearly or learn or not hyper-focus on one small tiny thing, or, not perseverate, or move their hands in a way that makes us uncomfortable, or they could lose weight, or. I mean, this really is sort of the modern day outgrowth of the medical model. And it reflects a real problem in how we framed our thinking about disability through history. And it continues to be the biggest barrier to how we move people with disabilities forward today. It is probably one of the most pernicious forms of victim blaming and one of the most dangerous things that we encounter sort of on a day-to-day basis. It stops our movement forward. And takes our eyes off of where the change needs to happen, which is in the barriers that society erects for us. Because the problem is that if we allow those types of mottos, those types of premises to go unchecked. Lori's saying that she thought it was talking about society having a bad attitude, but I don't ever see it framed that way. I mean, I think that we see it, as, society has a bad attitude. They don't see the potential or the, but I think that when people say that, at least when I see it, on the cute kitten hang in their posters, to me, it usually is that, if you can overcome. You may be given a bad thing, but if you just have the right attitude about it, everything will be okay. That's kind of the way I see. That's the way I see it. So for better or for worse. But the problem is once we start with kind of those types of reductive statements, is that what we end up having is sort of a snowball effect, right? And so it becomes, and I've had people say this to me before, like, you should be nicer. You work with disabled people. And I said, well, you clearly don't know me. I mean, that's the first answer. But, but it happens a lot. Like this whole notion that we all like sit around and hug each other all the time. But and to me, that's that problem with that, you know, the worst disability is is attitude. You know, because again, it highlights that, you know, it's the expectation gets set by sort of non-disabled people. And so what ends up happening is that people with disabilities are seen as being a problem. People with disabilities are subjected to low expectations. You know, again, you know, if you can sort paper clips, lucky you. People with disabilities can then be perceived as a burden. People with disabilities are isolated or excluded. They're segregated. They're put into institutions. And once you congregate people like that, you dehumanize us. And once we're dehumanized, that leads to a greater opportunity, a greater amount of abuse and neglect, and ultimately to exploitation. I mean, and so we want to treat things as if they happen in isolation, but the reality is that it doesn't. The reality is that the way the bias exists in our society is that it does, in fact, I mean, and if you look at the way that the statistics play out, you know, if you look at the way that abuse, neglect, and exploitation happens, you know, is at first what happens is that people are devalued, and then people are isolated from any meaningful kind of support. They're treated as less than. You know, so their humanity is taken from them. And then when they're abused or neglected or exploited, that just is a natural kind of outgrowth of all of those things. I mean, and again, you know, look at what's happened in these institutions, look at what continues to happen in institutions to this very day. You know, look at Michael Hixson, look at Tinsley Lewis. I mean, it's just again and again and again. And so we have to remember that one of the things that we're pushing back are these norms. This idea that non-disabled is the norm. And so it gets to set values and expectations. So there's nothing, I always love it. There's nothing particularly beautiful about a staircase and ugly about a ramp. But these types of norms, setting these expectations based on non-disabled, is that it then also sets our priorities. So, you know, I have literally had people at domestic violence shelters say, well, you know, we really can't afford to hire a sign language interpreter for this deaf person. I mean, you know, and it's like, you know, you want to, in a nonviolent way, sort of shake them, right? Because this person here, that is exactly this, what they're experiencing is exactly what we're talking about here, right? Somebody who's being treated as less than human, and as a result of that is literally being physically or, you know, psychically or emotionally abused, you know, and or exploited. And instead of recognizing that the priority should be to move them back down the spectrum, to back them as far away from that as possible by giving them access, the priorities are set. You know, well, we wouldn't want to have to pay for an extra service for this person. And then similarly, that translates to, well, this is somebody who she's going to go back to her husband. You know, well, of course she's going to go back to her husband. He's the only person who speaks her language. You know, and if people looked at it through that different lens, if they appreciated that, then they would see, then they'd be more successful in providing services, you know, in that type of instance. So what do we do? What's the approach that we want to take? Yeah, Kelly was saying, yeah, found out domestic violence experience 40% higher occurrences. Yeah, exactly. And folks that are denied shelter because you have care. I mean, you know, and again, and we're not just, I mean, in DV shelters, shelter of all types. I mean, and so when we're looking at, you know, hurricane, you know, shelter from storms, when we're looking at, you know, Red Cross facilities, people's ability to bring in PCAs, even people's ability to bring PCAs and support staff into the hospital with them with COVID to help facilitate understanding or communication or just support. The fact that we're having to fight for these things, right? You shouldn't have to fight for these things. But the only reason we have to fight for these things is because non-disabled set the norm, right? The norm is I walk in and I am perfectly fine, except for that I have this, respiratory disease that's about to ravage my body and I'm going to be put on a vent. But hey, other than that, I'm totally cool. I don't need anybody to help me. Yeah, I don't need a sign language interpreter. So boom, in I go, triage directly into the system. I don't have to fight for these other things first. So anyhow, so what do we got to do? What do we have to push for? What we have to push for is presuming competence always. Most systems do the opposite. Literally, I was just talking to someone last week who's getting ready to graduate high school and is basically like, I don't want a guardian, but my mom thinks that this is the way this needs to go because my mom's always been my rep payee, right? And so, even today, here in 2020, in the middle of COVID, we're having to deal with these presumptions of incompetency. Literally, in January of this year, I helped a 21-year-old man with cerebral palsy get out from under a guardianship. I mean, literally, he comes in and I'm like, what's going on? Why does he have a guardian? And it's like, well, I don't know. He has CP. I'm like, yeah, so what? Yeah, that's all? I mean, what? Like, why the hell does he have a guardian? That doesn't make any sense. Well, we went back in time and we literally found the letter from the doctor in his case, which the doctor resubmitted when we made the motion to get rid of the guardian. And here's what the letter said, literally. PT period, patient, is disabled. PT will require a guardian his entire life, period, end of story. It's like, what? So anyhow, we got rid of that guardian. We have to do things to maximize people's control over decision-making, self-directed services. We have to look at supported decision-making. We've got to expand. And sometimes we say, you start with helping people maximize control over decision-making in the smallest aspects of their life. And just like, cutting teeth, build it out to the bigger things in our lives as well, right? Well, Carrie does all right without a guardian, so we'll let her ride for now, I guess. So we need to make sure that we make information and resources available to folks. Meaningful choice doesn't happen in a vacuum. Okay, people have to know that they have choices, that they have options. Think about those parents who didn't, who in New Jersey, who didn't understand what kind of services might have been able to have been brought in to the home for their children, who didn't understand that they could get together and have, like here in Kansas, we have a technology assisted waiver, you can develop those programs and those systems that keep your kids in their homes so that they don't have to go away to a facility. We have to get barriers out of the way. Historically, physical barriers are the easiest thing to do, but recognizing that not all barriers are environmental, that barriers can be programmatic. Are we using cognitive friendly language in our materials? Do we always have alternative formats available, or we just do it on request? That's kind of one of the issues that I've been thinking a lot about recently, is the difference between access and accommodation, right? Am I providing access, or am I simply accommodating people when they need it? Can we offer more breaks, or can we start later with meetings, or can we have note takers or multiple modalities of communication? How can we modify the existing systems to provide support to people? Are the systems themselves just too complicated to work? I actually ended up, we talked earlier about that 14C feedback that Department of Labor was doing last summer. That system itself was so complicated and infuriating. I actually filed an Office of Civil Rights complaint against the input process, because you had to have an email and you had to verify the account, and then you could only answer one of these questions. It was such total bullshit. It was impossible to navigate. And so, so looking at, can the system, is it readily understandable? Is it usable for people, or do they have to have a freaking PhD to get it done? And then finally, looking at how can we provide things in the most integrated setting. This is the most important paradigm shift that Olmsted provided for us. Okay, when I first started working in disability spaces in the early 1990s, and I could barely drive. No, I'm just kidding. I was like, I just graduated high school. So, but when I started working in disability spaces, everybody, they thought they were so cool because it was like the least restrictive environment, right? And what Olmsted gave us is a paradigm shift from saying, what's the least amount we can keep people from doing things, to what's the greatest amount that we can include people into our communities. And so I tell folks that I consider it to be taking the approach of least restrictive environment is that they would remove every other bar from a jail cell, versus most integrated setting, which is they just open the door to the cell and let you out. And so looking at our systems and how can we open those doors to let folks out instead of just, not obscuring their view of the outside world as much. That's where we want to go. That's where we want things to be. So finally, kind of in closing here, we have, there's a picture of Lois Curtis with the words, "Where do we go from here?" Lois Curtis is a Black woman with short hair, an enormous smile that spread across her entire face. She's wearing a black and white shawl, gold hoop earrings, and has on a gold braid necklace. We must embrace our past so that we can open ourselves up to a more inclusive and more integrated future. In talking about the Olmsted case, we have to recognize that Lois Curtis, who is one of the sheroes of our story, is a named plaintiff in the decision that held that it is in fact our right, our civil right, to live in the most integrated setting. And Lois Curtis herself is a person who lives at the intersection of Black, female, someone with mental health disabilities, and someone with developmental disabilities. And so I think that the most, aside from continuing the work of independent living and moving that ball forward, one of the most important questions that we have to ask ourselves, one of the most important challenges we have to issue for ourselves, is whether Lois Curtis would feel welcome in the disability spaces that we occupy today. Whether our current independent living movement, whether our disability justice movement would value her experiences, whether her Blackness would set her too far apart from the way that our movement has developed or the way our movement is going, whether her voice would be loud enough or fast enough to get a word in edgewise, whether we could support the involvement of and the agency of people with developmental disabilities, whether we can accept the barriers and the judgments that are applied to people with mental health disabilities. We have to ask ourselves in the spaces that we're building today, whether capital C community would be a reality that includes Lois, or if, she might just instead be offered a small home-like community located on a campus with a bus to take her to and from the places she needs to go, or the places that we think that she belongs. We're 30 years after the enactment of the ADA. We are nearly a century away from Buck v. Bell, and it's as good a time as any to reflect on our movement, to explore our own biases, and to really cast our gaze forward toward building a more inclusive and more integrated community. And this means that we all have to commit ourselves as much to the independent living history and philosophy as we commit ourselves to doing the work of anti-racism. It means looking at, examining, and calling out our own ableism. And this means accepting the privilege that we do have and then using that privilege to address these inequities. It's going to mean discomfort. It's going to mean struggle. It's going to require that we amplify that discomfort and that struggle so that we can really meaningfully challenge systems that would medicalize us, that would infantilize us, that would isolate us, demean us, demoralize us, and as we know now, will even kill us. But if we can do this, if we can do this work, if we can move ourselves forward, if we can open ourselves up wide enough, the groundwork that's been laid, the equity groundwork that is inherent to the Americans with Disabilities Act, that doesn't exist in any other civil justice space. That's ours. That is uniquely ours, and it is critically important to addressing not just disability issues, but race issues, gender issues, sexual orientation issues. All of those things rely on our mutual success. And ultimately, if we make it, then it could mean that we do have that capital C community. So that's really kind of all I've got. I don't know. I've been trying to kind of, I'm really crappy at the chat box, but I've been trying to sort of follow it along. Is there anything, do folks have things they want to say? Anything anybody else wants to talk about, or?
There's just so many compliments, Amy, and thankfulness for the gratitude for the presentation.
You are absolutely phenomenal.
We get caught up in our own day-to-day work, and it's nice to take a step back for a minute and remember what's happening.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, the day-to-day work is so important in moving us, in moving the movement forward. I mean, that's where it happens. It's nice, again, it's fun. It's easy to show up in DC and get arrested, and I call it angry meditation, right? But really where the important stuff happens is on a day-to-day basis. That 21-year-old who gets out of their guardianship, the people we help get work and find their house, anybody you've ever moved into a place of their own the first time. That's magic,
Well, thank you for an incredible sort of overview and reminder that there is a big picture out there that we need to keep in our minds.
Thank you very much. Take care, everyone.
Thank you so much.
If no one has further questions, I don't think there are, Amy, it's, mostly people are.
Sorry to hold you so long anyhow, so.
No, it's great. Thank you. People were making comments, and I, doing some private chats trying to get people connected to things, but we do want to give a second for announcements, right? And Lydia, I don't know if you wanted to take back over, or if you want me to just ask for announcements, or what you'd like to do. Did I lose Lydia? Oh, it's possible. Okay, she may have had to go. But I just want to give a minute for community announcements. I know, Shannon, are you gonna talk about the protests, the BIPOC protests that are coming up? I get to put my staff on the spot.
Who do we have for next week's show?
Next week's show is Randy Ames from Disability Rights Maryland, and she's going to be speaking about asking for reasonable accommodations in housing, as well as the eviction process and concerns that we all have, given that the CDC's piece gets lifted at the end of this calendar year to go back for evictions, although I think we all know probably some that have happened anyways. But that's next week, Disability Rights Maryland. Oh, shoot.
Give an announcement.
Go ahead, Katie. Then I'll either find Shannon's or see if Abiola wants to do it.
Okay, so I don't know if any of you have heard about Independence Now's virtual murder mystery, but I recently bought my costume because I'm going to win, and I'm going to win the murder mystery. I'm going to win it all. So I hope you will join us. Us being Independence Now in the virtual murder mystery, because I am so excited.
There are still tickets available, so join us for some fun on November 1st. Abiola, do you want to talk about the protest, or should I go back and find Shannon sent me the info?
Sure. Well, I mean, I just quickly review that the Black and Disabled Lives Matter protest is going to be in 3 different locations. So there'll be at least three different opportunities for persons to participate. It's going to be one location. The first one is going to be at Wilson Boulevard Excuse me, I should back up. All on the 24th of October, that's on Saturday. So the whole day is going to be about protest. Starting at 11 o'clock in the morning, we'll be out in Virginia at Wilson Boulevard and George Mason Drive in Arlington, Virginia. Then coming into Silver Spring, starting at 3 o'clock, from 3 to 5 p.m. Right in downtown Silver Spring, right across from the movie theater at Veterans Plaza. And then, well, there'll also be a series of discussions. That the first series of discussions is going to be just talking about the grassroots efforts of persons who are Black, Indigenous, people of color, of diverse disabilities. And so we're calling this sort of pop-up protest. But the overall name is for the protest is Invisible No More. And this is going to be a first in a series of pop-up events throughout Maryland, DC, and Virginia. We're rallying Black disabled voices to unite in peaceful protest, despite the COVID having such a negative impact on our particular demographic. So it's unique in that it's inclusive of families, but also specifically families of color or with children of color who also have disabilities. So we're encouraging not just the usual suspects that show up for our protests, but it is a family-oriented event. So that is the idea. It is to include, be as inclusive as possible. And so all stakeholders are welcome from all walks of life. And details, of course, are available on Facebook. We also have a GoFundMe page to support. We'll be wearing these fabulous T-shirts, BDLM.
There's a couple people on who can model those T-shirts today, Heather and Crosby.
And if you're interested and you want to be part of it, I'll drop the email that you can contact for more details. But the official spokesperson is a person named Sharon Dunham, and the email is invisiblenomordmv@gmail.com. I'm dropping that in the chat now.
Are there other community announcements?
Actually, two things. One, I want a hoodie.
You're welcome to purchase it at any time. It's a fundraiser for Independence Now.
Great.
I've never gotten an announcement of these hoodies to purchase.
I will be happy to send you an email, my friend.
And I'm going to be at the murder mystery, so it's not like I'm not a contributor. I just didn't know about the hoodies, and my staff are buying them. That's rude, but okay. Yeah.
The other thing I wanted to say, so Maryland is having their statewide transit plan survey. And for anyone on this call that doesn't know about it, it's the transit plan that should shape the next 50 years of transit. And again, it is a survey. It's going to end on October the 25th at 11:59 p.m. So I am going to include it in the chat box. Even if you don't use the transit services, there are a lot of questions on there that you can actually answer, even by not using the transit. So it does help if you do fill it out. And again, whether you use transit or not, it's very important, especially for people with disabilities and elderly. So that way we can try to get equal transit opportunities for everyone, including rideshare services throughout the state, not just in certain parts of the state.
Sarah, this is Betsy Luking. I just wanted to tag along with what Bong just said. If the Montgomery County Commission on People with Disabilities has asked for a moratorium on designated bike lanes and floating bus stops because they are dangerous for people to cross. Especially people who are blind or who have a physical disability. I mean, they're dangerous. The bicyclists don't stop. So I think that's an issue that probably we need to look at nationally, what's happening and what's going to be happening with our roads and with the e-scooters. They abandon them in some cities, and with the bicycles in the sidewalks. So I think we have some work to do here to make sure they think of all people when they're putting in transportation items, whether they will work for the whole community and not at the expense of a population. Just equity.
Thank you.
So while we have the question of Bong, are floating bus stops in that transit plan that you were talking about at all? Because I didn't see them in there.
Yes, but indirectly.
Well, yeah, they're hiding them.
Okay. Because they claim up here that it's all experimental, blah, 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 but I wasn't aware that they're actually part of the long-term plan. So I'll look through the plan again and see if I can track them down.
Yeah, they definitely have some not removable ones in certain counties.
Gotcha. Okay, thank you. Any other community announcements? Your organization is important and it needs to be part of our awareness about issues of what's going on with folks with disabilities. So speak up.
Okay.
Nope.
How are you? How are you?
Hi,
Good.
Musa. Hi, Musa.
Yeah,
How
how
are
you doing?
you? And hello to
I'm
Delisa
fine.
as well. Did you have a comment, Musa?
Yeah, I like this comment. You know, I like it so much. So what you gonna do? Make me know so I can get there all the time. You know.
Sure, Musa.
Okay.
Thank you for your comments.
Okay. Thank you.
Heather has maybe the last comment here, Mike.
Fire
Just
away.
wanted to remind everyone that the Maryland Charity Campaign has kicked off, and I'm pretty certain that all of the centers for independent living around the state participate in the Maryland Charity Campaign. So when you're considering being a participant, find your local SIL and support us through Maryland Charity Campaign.
Especially accessible resources for independence.
Yeah, and if you can't
especially
remember them, you could always use the Image Center.
Don't speak that name.
Hey, listen, thank you all very much. What a joy this is to do every week. We'll see you all next week. And in 2 weeks, we do not have a program scheduled, but we will. Trust me on that. So thank you all very much for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye now.
Excellent.
Take care, everyone.
Excellent.
Excellent.